Penetration testing. Penetration testing is similar to vulnerability assessments. However, with a vulnerability assessment, we look for and try to determine, identify the vulnerabilities or weaknesses within our systems, and therefore, as a report, try to emphasize which ones are more important, that those vulnerabilities can be fixed before a hacker could exploit them. A vulnerability assessment is non-invasive in the way that it doesn't attempt to break into a system and do damage. And very often a vulnerability assessment may be more wide-reaching, might be testing all the various elements of the system. Whereas a penetration test tends to be a little bit more focused. It's looking at specific areas that may have been identified in a vulnerability, and in that area, the pen test attempts to test the effectiveness of then the preventative controls as well as the effectiveness of the detection. Whether or not a penetration would be noticed, would it alert the staff? And part of this, of course, is checking then the incident response strategy of the organization. If a penetration test does break in, and then the systems, they do notice it, we want to see whether or not the staff then responds correctly to that exploit. With a pen test, we actually attempt to break in. In many cases, we simulate being a hacker. We use many of the same tools, many of the same techniques. And what we're doing by this is validating whether or not our information security program would truly stop a real hacker. We try to exploit any of those known vulnerabilities or find a vulnerability that we can exploit so we're able to break in. But it's important as well to remember that a penetration test is not always technical. It's not always trying to break in through the firewall or break the wireless, though those are some of the most common types of pen tests, going after web applications, for example. But in many cases, a pen test can be trying to pick the lock, get into the building, in some way violate the physical security controls. We also can try social engineering. One of the more common penetration tests lately has been putting USB sticks in a parking area next to the building. Seeing whether or not somebody, when they come in the morning, sees this USB lying on the ground, picks it up and carries it into the office. And if they do they insert that into one of the machines in the office, which could bring an infection in, bypassing completely the firewalls and other perimeter-based defenses we have. So pen tests are important, but pen tests are not just a lot of unrelated activities. There should be a very clearly defined methodology and process used in executing a penetration test. A penetration test has the risk of doing harm. We might disable functionality. We might actually break something. So when we do a penetration test, it should only be done with a clear authorization from management. And part of that authorization should include the determination of the scope. What are the boundaries? What are we allowed to test and what aren't we allowed to test? What should we do if we do break in? So by determining the scope, we all clearly understand the parameters under which this test will be conducted. You could even call it, if you want, the rules of engagement. We will also specify the methodologies to be used. Tools, social engineering. Will we try doing email spoofing in addition to this? Will we try doing penetration testing physically as well as technically? Will we go after their wireless? Will we try to break in through their administrator access? We determine and define the methodologies to be used in the test. And the rules of engagement clearly state things like, well, not only scope and methodology, but also who do we report to? When the report is given, obviously this report could be very damaging to an organization. It can indicate some serious problems. And we want to make sure that that report is only given to the right person. If we've used an external company to do a pen test, sometimes a penetration test will be done internally. Other times we'll use external vendors. You want clear rules with relation to the external vendor, what they can do and certainly what they will do with the information once the test or engagement is finished. Based on all of this, we gain written approval from management. We sometimes call this your get out of jail free card. This protects us, especially if this is being done by an external organization. Because if, for example, we were caught by the IT department or by the security department, and the security department was not aware that this test had been approved, well, we want some way to verify or to prove that we had the authorization to conduct this test. One thing we must always be careful of is to verify any information we've been given to ensure it's correct. Let's say, for example, the company gave us, this is our company name, company website, and our IP addresses. You want to verify that those are exactly the right IP addresses. So we don't find that by mistake maybe we're penetration testing against another company whose IP address space bordered up against the true company that engaged us for this test. We want to make sure that we don't attack the wrong organization. And for example, with wireless, this is often important, since wireless quite often will have a different name than the name of the company. And yet in many buildings we'll find wireless access points of a number of different companies. They are all reachable. Well, you want to make sure you're only attacking the correct wireless device. Then we agree on how will we communicate the results of the test and the distribution of the report. The one thing we should also agree on with this is that if we find something serious during the test, we may not wait until the engagement is finished before we begin to communicate this with management. We want to make sure that management is aware immediately if there's a serious problem that needs to be fixed right away. So then, based on the authorization, rules of engagement, scope, and methodologies, we begin to perform the test. The test is planned out, which includes things such as how do we get access, maybe to the building, to the systems. In some cases, the test will be conducted externally. In other cases, we will actually then have parts of the test we may conduct internally from within the organization. Once we have a plan, our strategy, we then start to gather information. We probe around through both active and passive attacks. A passive attack can be sniffing, for example, or an active attack might be doing something like a port scan and actually trying to check to see what ports are open on a firewall. We attempt to discover as much as we can about the company. For example, a common point of discovery is to check things like job postings and do Google searches. When I do discovery, I can often find out through a job posting what technologies, languages, and so on are being used by the company, because the job posting says must have experience in this tool, for example. This allows me to map out as much as I can about the company before we even have begun testing. Then we try to attack. We look for places where there could be a weakness, a gap, a vulnerability. And if we find it, we exploit it. Now, in some cases, something might appear to be a vulnerability, but it really wasn't. There were countermeasures in place and controls that stopped that attack. But other cases, we will break in. We will be able to exploit. And when we do that, we'll quite often gather evidence that the fact that we did break in that will be then included in the final report. so that no one can come back later and say, well, you didn't really break in. Well, here you go. Here's the evidence. Here's a file we've captured, for example, or here's a user ID we created on the system. Now, it's important that if we have opened a door into the system in conducting the exploit, that door, of course, is closed. That we remove then any damage that we've done while we're in there as well. Then we create a report. We report on what was the scope, the methodology, and certainly what did we find. And that's important for the organization, so they can see what we've looked at. Because it could well be that they need to do further pen tests of other areas that were not in the scope of this report. Just to have attacked, for example, the web application doesn't mean the entire network is secure. And in the report then, once we've listed what we've actually found, now we will begin to list our recommendations. What are the suggestions we make what they should do about that? When we deliver a pen test, we don't usually fix anything. Instead, we give management the information about what should be fixed and maybe a recommendation on what they could do to fix it. And management now has to look at it and schedule what's most important, which of these things are serious enough that they feel that they should address and fix them. The test conditions could be, of course, either an internal red team that tries to test our networks, and these are usually what we would call then a full knowledge test. An internal team really knows everything about the company. They know the network layouts, configurations, and the phone numbers, the org charts, everything they need to be able to do various types of pen tests. And many large organizations have a very good internal red team that is continuously doing vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. But it's always good to have a third party take a look at our system. There's things that because we're there all the time, we might not see anymore. So having an external test can be valuable. Now, external tests have a disadvantage because they don't know everything about the company. And in fact, in some cases, we will tell them very little. What we would call this, of course, is a zero knowledge test. Here's the name of our company. See what you can find. Now, that's a fairly expensive test. It has to start with things like Google searches and so on. But it often can be good to do that because that can sometimes reveal information about our company that might be on the internet that we didn't even know was out there. The more common type of a test done by an external party is what we'll call partial knowledge. Partial knowledge is where we give them things like IP addresses. So they already have at least some information, and then they plan and execute the test according to that knowledge we've given them. So a partial knowledge test is not like a hacker. A hacker is zero knowledge, unless the hacker has someone inside leaking them information. But a partial knowledge test is a lot less expensive and also can be a very effective way to test certain parts of our system. Internal teams do full knowledge tests. They know everything. And of course, if they are diligently testing our systems all the time, hopefully they will find if there was something maybe that was misconfigured or changed very quickly. The problem with a pen test is that a pen test is usually done on a scheduled periodic basis, maybe every quarter, maybe once a year, where a full knowledge internal test can be running every day. One of the things we'll do to test especially the competence of our staff is conduct the test without telling, say, our network and system administrators that the test is ongoing. We want to see whether or not our system administrators are able to detect the attack while it's going on. And we call this a blind test. And the purpose of this, of course, is that we want to see if they noticed it, do they follow the incident response plan? Do they escalate the problem correctly? In some cases, we won't even tell security. And this is, of course, what we'll call then a double blind test. A double blind means that we have then hidden the information both from the network and system administrators as well as from security, again, so that we can test what is the response strategy. Are people monitoring our systems and networks? If they see something, do they then respond effectively? We invest a tremendous amount of money every year in monitoring. You take, for example, many organizations have security information event management systems. Those generate tremendous amounts of data and logs. But we do a double-blind test, and what do we find? We find that we might as well not have had that device at all. Because even though that device maybe noticed the attack, well, nobody was monitoring. Nobody was acting upon the information if that SIM system actually even created an alert.